She didn't cry when he changed the locks. She stood in the hallway of the apartment that had been her home for 2 years, holding a single duffel bag and a manila envelope that had been handed to her with the casual indifference of someone returning a library book. The door was closed. The deadbolt turned, and Ren Dunn, 18 years old that very morning, stood in the fluorescent-lit corridor of a building in Portland, Oregon, and did not cry. She had promised herself that much at least. She would not give him that. The hallway smelled of other people's dinners. Garlic from 4B. Something burnt from the N unit. The carpet was the color of old mustard, and the overhead light flickered every few seconds with a soft electrical stutter. She stood there for a long moment, the bag strap cutting into her shoulder, the envelope pressed against her chest, and she breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate. The way you breathe when you are trying to hold yourself together with nothing but willpower and the specific fury of someone who refuses to fall apart in a public hallway. She had $200 in her pocket, the last of her waitressing money cash she had kept in a coffee can under the bathroom sink. Money that Garrett Hollis had never known about, which meant it was the only money in the world that was entirely, completely, and irrevocably hers. $200, 18 years old, and a piece of land in a county she had never visited left to her by a father she had never known. She walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. This is where the story begins. But to understand what happened next, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand how a girl ends up standing in a hallway with nothing but a duffel bag and $200 on her 18th birthday. Because it doesn't happen all at once. It never does. It happens slowly in stages and small surrenders that feel reasonable at the time, in doors that seem like they're opening when really they're closing behind you. It starts with loss. It always starts with loss. Ren's mother, Diane, died of cancer when Ren was 14. It was a long illness, the kind that takes years to finish what it starts. And by the end, there was very little of the woman left. Ren had spent those years watching her mother shrink first in body and then in spirit, and then she had spent the months after watching everything her mother had built get quietly dismantled by the business of dying. The apartment leased the car, the small personal items divided among relatives who had appeared only at the end. People Ren barely recognized who took things with the brisk efficiency of people who had already done their grieving in private and were ready to move on. Her grandmother Ruth took Ren in without fanfare. Ruth was a practical woman who lived in a small, tidy apartment in Northeast Portland and who expressed love through consistent presence rather than affectionate words. She made meals. She showed up to school conferences. She was steady and she was reliable and she was not warm in any demonstrative way, but she was there, which was more than Ren could say for most people in her life at that point. Ruth died 16 months later, a stroke while she was doing the dishes on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Ren came home from school and found her. She was 16 years old and she had now lost every person she had ever depended on. She was a ward of the state, a file number, a case to be managed. The foster system was not cruel to her. It was simply indifferent in the way that large institutions are indifferent to individual circumstances, and indifference at 16 when you have just buried your grandmother, and before that your mother feels worse than cruelty, because at least cruelty acknowledges that you exist. Indifference simply processes you and moves on. This is when Garrett Hollis entered her life. He was 22, he had light brown hair and an easy smile, and the particular kind of confident stillness that reads especially to a grieving 16-year-old girl as reliability. He was studying business at Portland State. He volunteered at a community center on weekends, which is where Ren met him on a Saturday morning when she was filling out a scholarship application at one of the center's computer stations and couldn't figure out how to format the financial hardship section. He sat down beside her and helped. He brought coffee the following Saturday without being asked. He remembered the names of her caseworkers, the dates of her court hearings about Ruth's small estate, the deadlines for the forms she needed to file. He was present in a way that felt deliberate and caring, and for a girl who had watched presence disappear from her life in stages, the sensation of being noticed, of being specifically attended to, was intoxicating in the way that water is intoxicating to someone who has been thirsty for a very long time. She should not be blamed for what came next. She was 16, she was grieving, she was alone, and the world had conspired to place in front of her a person who looked exactly like safety. His family lived in Lake Oswego in a house that seemed enormous to Wren, the first time she visited, with a long driveway lined with mature rhododendrons and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and something baking. His mother, Miriam Hollis, was a composed woman in her late 40s with dark, careful eyes and a way of speaking that made everything she said sound like a reasonable conclusion to an argument she had already won elsewhere. She welcomed Wren with the measured warmth of someone performing hospitality rather than feeling it setting a place at the dinner table asking appropriate questions about school, remembering the answers the following week. Wren didn't see any of this for what it was at the time. She saw a woman who had set a place at the dinner table for her. She saw a lit house and food on the stove, and people who seemed to want her there. To a girl who had spent 2 years watching people leave, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Garrett explained things to her patiently. About probate, about the estate process, about what would happen with Ruth's small accounts, and most importantly about the life insurance policy that Wren's mother had taken out years before she got sick, a policy that had accumulated quietly in the background of Wren's life and would pay out on her 18th birthday. It wasn't a fortune, $43,000. But it was the largest sum of money Wren had ever been associated with. And Garrett talked about it with the calm authority of someone who understood these things and wanted to help her understand them too, who was doing her a favor by explaining the complexity. He suggested she give him power of attorney, just until she turned 18 and could manage things herself. It was common, he said. Practical. His family's lawyer drew up the papers. Garrett walked her through each page, patient, unhurried, pointing to where she needed to sign. She signed where he pointed. She trusted him in the way that you trust the only solid thing in a room that is shaking. She did not read the fine print. 2 years passed. They were not unhappy years, and that was perhaps the most insidious part of the whole architecture. Garrett was attentive. The Hollis house continued to be warm and full of food. Wren finished high school, got decent grades, worked weekend shifts at a diner near the apartment she and Garrett now shared, and allowed herself slowly and with the considerable caution of someone who has been burned before to believe that things were going to be all right, that she had found something solid to stand on, that the worst part of her life was behind her and the future had a shape she could inhabit. She turned 18 on a Wednesday. The insurance policy paid out. Garrett told her he had some paperwork to go over with her, and she sat at the kitchen table in the apartment they now shared, the one whose lease was in his name, and watched him lay out a series of documents with the methodical care of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times and was finally performing it. The money was gone. Legally, cleanly, completely gone. The power of attorney documents she had signed at 16 contained language she had not noticed at the time. A clause about reimbursement of living expenses defined broadly enough to encompass 2 years of housing, food, transportation, and what the document called administrative costs associated with estate management. His mother's lawyer had drafted it with precision. It was airtight. There was nothing to dispute because there was nothing left to dispute it with and no money to hire anyone to try. Garrett was not apologetic. He was not even particularly cold. He was simply practical in the way of someone explaining a math problem that has already been solved and requires only acknowledgement, not discussion. The accounting is all here, he said, not looking up from the papers. Housing, meals, the legal fees for managing your grandmother's estate. It adds up. Wren looked at the number at the bottom of the last page. 0. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. My mother saved that money for me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. She did, he agreed. And it went to take care of you. That's what she would have wanted. There was something in the way he said it. A certainty. A practiced smoothness, as if he had said it before, perhaps in a mirror, perhaps to himself on the drive over, testing the weight of it, checking that it would land correctly. She looked at his face and saw something she had not seen before, or had not allowed herself to see, the slight tension around his jaw that appeared not when he was worried, but when he was waiting. He was waiting to see how she would react. He had prepared for several reactions. He was ready for all of them. She stood up from the table. She went to the bedroom. She took the duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. She packed what was hers, which was not much. Clothes, a few books, the small framed photograph of her mother that she kept on the nightstand. She took the manila envelope from the drawer of her bedside table, the envelope containing the deed to a piece of land in Harlow County, Oregon, that had belonged to her father. A man named Colt Dunn, who had died in a car accident when she was 5 years old, and who had never been more than a ghost at the periphery of her memory, a faint impression without context. She put the envelope in the bag. She went back to the kitchen. She picked up the coffee can from the high cabinet, the one she kept behind the spare dish towels, and put it in the outside pocket of the bag. Garrett's eyes followed the coffee can. He said nothing. "I'll have the rest of my things out by Friday," she said. "Wren." Something shifted in his voice. Something that had been entirely absent for the past hour, a warmth manufactured and suddenly restored like a light turned back on. "You don't have to leave. We can talk about this." She looked at him for one more moment. She looked at him with the clear, slightly exhausted gaze of someone who has just understood something fully and is still absorbing the dimensions of it. Then she picked up the duffel bag and walked out. She did not look back. She sat in the bus station for 6 hours from 10 at night until 4 in the morning. The station was a particular kind of miserable fluorescent and hard-seated smelling of disinfectant and diesel and the specific stale sadness of spaces designed for people in transit, people between one thing and the next, people who are somewhere they didn't plan to be. She was not the only person there at that hour. There was a young woman with two small children who kept falling asleep across the plastic chairs and waking with a start. There was an old man in a green jacket who stared at the departure board with the focused intensity of someone who had been staring at it for hours and would continue staring at it for hours more. There was a teenager asleep across 3 chairs with a backpack over his face. Wren sat with the duffel bag between her feet and the manila envelope on her lap, and she thought about the land. She had known about it in a vague, theoretical way since she was 14, since her mother's death had set the estate process in motion, and a lawyer had contacted her grandmother to notify her of the existence of the parcel. Land in Harlow County, Oregon, 5.5 acres. The deed had been filed in her father's name, Colt Dunn, with Wren listed as the sole beneficiary upon reaching adulthood. Ruth had kept the envelope in a file folder in her kitchen drawer alongside the utility bills and the lease renewal papers, treating it with the same practical neutrality she brought to everything. After Ruth died, Wren had kept it with her own documents, moving it from the group home to Garrett's apartment without thinking very much about what it represented. Garrett had thought even less of it. He had looked at it once early in their arrangement, flipping through the pages with the desultory interest of someone who had already assessed the value and found it negligible. "Back taxes owed," he had said, handing it back without meeting her eyes. "Middle of nowhere. Probably just scrubland. Maybe worth something if timber prices go up, but that could be years. It's yours from your dad. Sentimental value, maybe." She had put it back in the drawer and hadn't thought much about it again until tonight. Now she looked at the deed in the dim station light. The paper was old, thick with age, the fibers of it dense and heavy in her hands. The type was faint in places, struck by a machine that had been old, even when the document was new. Parcel 7, Section 12, Township 34, South Range 6, East Willamette Meridian. It named the acreage. It named the location described in the language of surveyors, miles down a county road that her phone map showed dwindling from asphalt to gravel to a line that simply ended. And at the bottom of the legal description, there was a handwritten addition notarized separately in a hand she didn't recognize, but that felt somehow familiar in its firmness. The letters formed with the deliberate pressure of someone who wrote carefully because what they were writing mattered, including all structures and improvements thereon, specifically the primary dwelling and associated outbuilding workshop. A cabin and a workshop. She had $200. The back taxes on the property were significant, but not catastrophic. She had checked once online. She could probably sell the land for $10, maybe $12,000, enough for a deposit somewhere, enough to start over with something resembling a foundation. Enough to be practical. The sensible thing was to sell it. She bought a bus ticket to Oak Ridge, Oregon. One way, $86. It was not a decision she could fully explain even to herself. It was not hope exactly. She was too depleted for hope, too scraped out by the events of the past 12 hours to produce anything as energized as hope. It was something more elemental than hope, closer to stubbornness, closer to the specific refusal that rises in you when you have been told through the systematic actions of another person's calculated cruelty that you are worth nothing beyond what can be extracted from you. Garrett had taken the money. He had taken the apartment, the warmth of the house in Lake Oswego, the illusion of a family. She would not also give him her willingness to run from the one thing that still had her name on it. She would see the land. She would stand on it and look at it and make her decision on the ground rather than in a bus station at 2 in the morning. The bus left at 4:15. She slept against the window for most of the ride, a shallow, restless sleep that was more exhaustion than rest. When she surfaced, the flatlands had given way to mountains. The Cascades rose dark and immense against a sky that was transitioning from deep black to the bruised indigo of pre-dawn, and then slowly as the bus climbed to the first tentative gray of morning. The forest pressed close on both sides, Douglas fir so tall and dense that the highway felt like a corridor cut through something ancient and largely indifferent to human passage, something that had been here long before the road and would be here long after the asphalt was reclaimed. Oak Ridge was smaller than she had expected. One main street, a handful of storefronts whose signs were weathered to a pleasant illegibility, the kind of town that exists in the specific geography of the American West, where the timber industry was once the entire economy and is now mostly memory and occasional seasonal work. A grocery store with a hand-lettered weekly special sign in the window, a hardware store, a tavern with neon beer logos, a post office that was barely larger than a single-car garage. The air when she stepped off the bus was cold and sharp and smelled of pine resin and wood smoke from somewhere uphill, and it was so different from the city's permanent exhaust and concrete smell that it hit her like a physical thing, clean and almost aggressive in its clarity. The bus driver was a heavy-set man with a kind face who watched her step down with the mild concern of someone who has driven routes like this long enough to recognize when a passenger has arrived somewhere without quite intending to. "End of the line," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you." She had 5 miles to walk. There was no other option. She had confirmed this on her phone, which was now at 11% battery and falling. No taxi service, no ride share, no bus that went further into the hills. Just the road and her feet in the 5 miles between here and the property listed on the deed. She started walking. The first 2 miles were on asphalt, winding out of the small commercial center and into the hills. Traffic passed her twice, both times pickup trucks going the other direction, neither slowing. The road climbed steadily. The trees grew taller and closer, the canopy thickening overhead until the sky was visible only in strips. After the second mile, the asphalt gave way to gravel, the transition abrupt and decisive. And after the gravel to a rutted track that was more intention than road, more suggestion than infrastructure. Her sneakers were not designed for this. Her legs, already tired from the overnight bus, began to seriously complain around the 3rd mile. She kept walking. The light was failing by the time she found it. Not dramatically, not with the speed of a switch being thrown, but in the slow Oregon way of autumn evenings, the sky softening from blue to gray to a deep early dark that came down through the trees like something being poured. Her phone had been dead for an hour. She was navigating by memory of the map she had studied earlier, and by the occasional evidence of old tire tracks pressed into the soft earth of the track. Evidence that someone had once come and gone from wherever she was going. She almost walked past the turnoff entirely. It was marked by nothing except a rusted steel post that had once held a sign and now held only the ghost of one. The holes where the bolts had been, the post itself leaning at 15 degrees from vertical. She turned onto a track that was barely visible, more of a parting in the undergrowth than a path. The blackberry canes reached from both sides, and she pushed through them, feeling the thorns catch at her jacket. And then the trees opened. A clearing, small, maybe half an acre, ringed by Douglas firs that stood like walls. And in the clearing, off to one side of it, the cabin. She stopped walking and looked at it. It was standing. That was the first thing she registered, with a relief so physical it made her knees soft. It was standing. After everything Garrett had implied, after her own worst imaginings on the bus, she had been bracing herself for a pile of rotted lumber and a concrete foundation slowly being reclaimed by Blackberry. But the cabin was standing. It was not standing well. The roof sagged dramatically on the left side, a slow-motion avalanche of moss-covered shingles waiting for the right winter storm to send them to the ground. The porch had given up entirely, its boards collapsed inward, the posts that had held the overhang now leaning against each other like tired old men at the end of a long day. One window was whole, one was broken, the glass long gone, the frame dark and open to weather and whatever else chose to enter. Blackberry and ivy had climbed the log walls to a height of 4 feet, and the logs themselves were dark with moisture and decades of exposure. But it was standing. The walls were solid, the structure held. She stood in the clearing for a long moment alone in a way that was so complete it had its own quality, its own specific texture. The silence pressed against her ears. There were no other lights anywhere she could see. There was no sound of traffic. There was the dark in the cabin and the cold coming steadily down through the trees. She picked up her bag and walked toward it. The door was heavy, plank-built, bound with iron straps that had gone to the deep red-brown of old rust. There was no knob, just a latch, a simple iron bar resting in a bracket. She lifted it. The door swung inward with a groan of protest from hinges that had not moved in a very long time, a sound that seemed enormous in the forest quiet. The smell came first. Old wood, damp earth, the cold ghost of wood smoke from a fire that had gone out years before she arrived. And underneath all of it, something metallic faint, almost imagined. The ghost of a smell she couldn't quite identify. She stepped inside. The darkness was complete except for the moonlight coming through the broken window, a shaft of pale silver that illuminated a narrow rectangle of the floor and part of the table at the center of the room. She waited while her eyes adjusted. One room, the table rough-hewn with 2 chairs. Against the far wall, a bed frame stripped to bare wood. To her left, a cast-iron stove, its pipe disappearing into the ceiling. Dust over everything thick and undisturbed settled over every surface like a fine gray fabric. Cobwebs in the corners and the rafters across the dark face of the stove. On the mantelpiece above the cold hearth, the dim shapes of small objects she couldn't make out. She moved carefully, one hand outstretched. The floorboards creaked beneath her but did not give. She ran her hand over the table surface, over the back of one of the chairs. She touched the cold iron of the stove. These were real. They were solid. They had been used by someone who sat in these chairs and cooked on this stove and slept in that bed frame against the wall. Her father. The word landed differently here than it ever had before. Her father had not been a presence in her life, had not even been a coherent absence, not the aching, active kind. He had been more like a room that was never spoken of, a door that was always closed, and eventually she had simply stopped wondering what was behind it. Her mother had said very little in the years before she got sick, and very little more in the years during, and by the time Ren was old enough to form the right questions, there was no one left who could answer them. He died when I was 5. He worked with his hands. That was essentially all she had. And now this. She moved along the wall, her fingers trailing the logs. In the corner beside the bed frame, they found something else. A wooden chest low to the ground about the size of a large shoebox, bound with iron straps like the door. An ornate lock on the front iron, rusted but intact. She knelt and tried to pull it toward the light, but it was wedged tight in the corner, and when she felt around its base, she found why. The floorboard beneath it was loose. She worked her fingers into the crack and pulled. It lifted, unnailed, deliberate. In the space beneath it was a shallow cavity, and in the cavity was a metal box cool and slightly damp to the touch. She pulled it out and set it beside the chest. She would open it later. Right now, there was the letter. She worked the chest free from the corner, scraping it across the gritty floor into the shaft of moonlight. The lock was old. She had no key. She looked around the room and found on the mantelpiece a fire poker, thin and iron. She inserted the tip into the lock and applied pressure slow and steady, and then more, and then a sharp crack rang through the cabin as the old iron gave way. The lid came up. Inside the chest was lined with faded red velvet, the color once deep crimson, and now the uncertain pink red of something that had aged in the dark for a long time. On the velvet lay 3 items. The first was a ring of keys, 3 of them. Iron, heavy, old-fashioned in their construction, the kind of keys you don't see anymore, long-shanked with elaborate bitting that suggested mechanisms of corresponding complexity. They were large. Whatever they unlocked was large too. The second was a locket on a fine silver chain. She opened it. Inside, a small photograph, faded at the edges, but clear enough at the center. A man with dark hair and a beard, his face open and laughing, holding a baby against his chest. The baby was very small. The man was looking at the baby in the way that people look at things they cannot believe they are allowed to have. She had to breathe for a moment before she could look at the other side of the locket. A lock of hair, pale and very fine. Baby hair. Her father, her. She held the locket for a long time without doing anything else. The third item was an envelope, thick cream-colored paper sealed with a coin-sized circle of dark red wax. On the front, in handwriting, she had never seen firm and clear and deliberate the letters form with the care of someone who understood that the words inside would need to travel a long distance. For Wren, on her 18th birthday. The world tilted slightly under her feet. He had known she would come here. He had planned for her to come here. This was not an accidental relic. This was not a forgotten box in an abandoned cabin. This was a message. A message written by a man who had been dead for 13 years, addressed to the daughter he had not seen since she was a toddler, timed precisely to reach her on the day she became an adult and the choices became hers to make. She broke the wax seal carefully with her thumbnail. The paper was heavy, good quality. The ink was dark and clean. She angled the pages to catch the moonlight and began to read. My dearest Wren, if you are reading this, you found it, which means you came, which means more than I can tell you, because it means that some part of you, after everything, still wanted to. I am going to tell you the truth because you deserve the truth, and because you have probably lived for a long time with a version of events that I want to correct. I need you to know that I did not leave because I didn't want you. I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, and that I did it for one reason and one reason only, which was to keep you safe. Let me explain what that means. Before I was your father, I was a blacksmith, not a hobbyist, not a weekend with a forge kit craftsman. I was a professional artist who worked in steel and iron and fire, who built gates and sculptures and architectural pieces for clients with serious money and in some cases serious problems. I was good at what I did, good enough to be sought out, good enough to take on a commission from people I should never have taken a commission from. I was young, I needed the money, I didn't ask the right questions, and when I was finished with the work and they were unhappy with the arrangement, unhappy in the way that certain kinds of men express unhappiness, I understood that what I owed them was not a refund. What I owed them was compliance. And when I could not give them compliance, they made it clear that the people closest to me would bear the cost. Your mother. You. You were 2 years old. I had one option that would protect you both. I had to disappear from your lives completely and permanently. I had to sever every connection between us so thoroughly that there was nothing left to use against me. I gave your mother everything I had, every dollar. I asked her to tell you I was gone for good, and to never tell you why, because the less you knew, the safer you were. I came here. This land had been mine for years, a dream I'd had before any of this happened, before everything went wrong. I had bought it with the first real money I ever made from a significant commission, planning a life on it that never had the chance to begin. I built this cabin with my own hands. I built the forge. I lived here for 2 years alone, working and trying to figure out what the rest of my life was supposed to look like. I wasn't supposed to be here long, but I stayed longer than I planned, and then one winter morning on the county road into town on ice, and in the dark, I ran out of time. They say it was an accident. It was. Sometimes that's all it is. But I had planned for time running out. I had planned for not being there to hand this to you myself. Everything you are about to find, I prepared deliberately and with great care because I needed to know that if I wasn't around, you would still have a choice. On this land, beyond this cabin, on the north side of the property built into the hillside, and disguised from the outside as nothing worth looking at, is my forge, my real work, the work of my life. The tools are there, the anvil, the hearth, everything I used to create waiting in the dark. One of the keys on that ring opens the main door. It's large, the largest of the three, and the lock will be stiff. Use your weight. Inside the forge, you will find everything I know. My journals, my designs, my notes on the craft. I left them for you in the event that you wanted them. And behind the left side of the hearth, there is a loose stone. Pull it out. Behind it, a metal box. Inside that box is $10,000 and a journal that is for you, not just about the work. I am giving you a choice, Ren. Not because I don't have a preference, but because I know that no one gets to make your choices for you. Not anymore. You can take the money, pay the back taxes, sell this land, walk away, and start something new. There is no shame in it. You owe me nothing. I was not there. I don't get to ask anything of you. Or you can stay. You can open the forge. You can pick up the journal and read what I left for you. You can light the fire and see what it feels like to hold a hammer, to work with metal, to take something that the world considers raw and worthless and shape it through force and heat and patience into something strong and useful and lasting. I know which choice I would make, but I know that's not my call. Whatever you decide, know this. There was not a day in the years I was gone that I did not think of you. There was not a single piece of work I made in that forge that I did not make for you in some way I cannot fully explain. You were the fire, Wren. You were always the fire. Your father, Colt Dunn. She read it twice, and then she sat down on the dusty floor of the cabin in the moonlight, and she pressed the letter against her chest, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. All of it. Everything she had been holding back in the hallway outside Garrett's apartment. Everything she had been compressing and controlling in the bus station, and on the bus, and on the 5-mile walk through the dark. The careful architecture of her composure came down all at once. She cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in a very long time. Not the tidy, manageable grief of public mourning, but something older and rawer. The grief of a girl who had been told her whole life that her father was simply gone, and had come to accept that as the complete story, and had now discovered that the story had another chapter. Had always had another chapter, and she was reading it at 18 years old alone on the floor of a cabin in Oregon, and he was not here to see her read it. She cried for the baby in the locket who never got to know him. She cried for the man in the photograph who had held that baby like she was the most valuable thing he had ever been trusted with. She cried for the years of silence, and the questions her mother had never answered, and the questions her grandmother had never answered, and the hollow space in the shape of a father that she had carried for as long as she could remember without ever having the right words for what it was. She cried until there was nothing left to cry, and then she sat in the quiet. After a while, she became aware of something. Not a sound or a sight, a sensation. The feeling of a room that is not as empty as it looks, as if the silence had a particular quality, a texture that it wouldn't have had if no one had ever lived here. As if the walls held the memory of warmth in the grain of the wood. She thought about Garrett. She let herself think about him clearly without flinching. About the 2 years. About the way he had been in the beginning, patient and attentive, the way that a good fisherman is patient and attentive, waiting for the right moment. About the way Miriam Hollis had watched her across the dinner table with those careful measuring eyes. about the paper she had signed at 16 without reading because you don't read the fine print with the person you trust completely. Before she left the apartment, she had taken the coffee can, but she had also taken something else. A small piece of paper she had found months ago tucked behind the kitchen drawer liner when she had been looking for a pen. She had found it and been confused by it and put it in her jacket pocket and then told herself she had forgotten about it, though she had not forgotten about it at all. She reached into the pocket now and unfolded it carefully. It was a note in a woman's handwriting. Neat, precise, the handwriting of someone organized and accustomed to being obeyed. At the top, a date that was 3 months before Garrett had walked into the community center where Wren was filling out a scholarship application. 3 months before she had ever seen his face. Below the date, her name, the name of her grandmother's estate lawyer, a number the exact amount of the life insurance payout down to the dollar. And below that, in the same neat hand, Harlow County, Oregon, Parcel 7. They had known. Miriam Hollis had known about the money and about the land before her son had ever introduced himself. This had not been a romance that had gone wrong. This had not been a family whose generosity had curdled over time into something calculating. This was the beginning. This was the plan from the very first day. Find the girl. Secure the assets. The land was part of the calculation before Wren even knew to wonder who was calculating. She put the note back in her pocket. She stood up. She looked around the cabin at the cold stove, at the bare bed frame at the table, and its 2 chairs, at the shaft of moonlight still falling through the broken window. She also remembered the metal box she had pulled from beneath the floorboard and set aside. She picked up the lantern she couldn't yet light and felt her way back to where she had left it. The box was smaller than the chest, latched rather than locked. She opened it. Inside were old receipts folded and faded, and a spare key she didn't recognize, a modern one, the kind cut by a machine at a hardware store. Nothing else. Whatever her father had wanted her to find, it wasn't here. It was in the forge. She picked up the keys from the chest. One of them opened a forge on the north side of the property, built into a hillside, hidden in plain sight, waiting in the dark for 13 years. She didn't know yet what she would do with a forge. She didn't know what it meant to pick up a hammer and work with iron and fire. She didn't know anything about this land, or the life that had been lived on it, or the craft that had been built here over a man's lifetime, and then left to wait for a daughter who might never come. But she had read his letter, she had his keys in her hand, and she was her father's daughter, though she was only just beginning to understand what that meant. She stepped out of the cabin into the cold night air. The stars above the clearing were extravagant, more stars than she had ever seen from inside a city, a depth and density of light that seemed almost aggressive after a lifetime of orange-lit suburban skies. The firs stood black around the edges of the clearing, enormous and still. She looked to the north. Somewhere in that darkness, built into a hillside and disguised as nothing worth looking at, was the forge, the real inheritance, the one that couldn't be emptied by a man with a lawyer and a plan, the one that was waiting. She walked toward it. The north side of the property was not a gentle walk. She pushed through ferns that came up to her waist, their wet fronds soaking through her jeans within the first 30 seconds. The ground rose sharply uneven and root-crossed, and she stumbled twice in the dark, catching herself on tree trunks that were wide enough to wrap both arms around. The cold had deepened since she'd stepped out of the cabin. Her breath came in small, visible clouds. The only light was the moon, and it was inconsistent, moving in and out of cloud cover, giving her 5 seconds of silver clarity and then taking it back completely. She almost missed it entirely. She had been moving uphill for what felt like 15 minutes, her hand outstretched to feel for what the letter had described. A wall, a flat vertical surface, something that would announce itself as different from the living wood and earth around it. And then her palm hit something that stopped her. Not rough bark, not the yielding resistance of a fern, something flat and cold and man-made. She stepped back and looked. The hillside in front of her looked like a hillside. That was the first thing, and the thing that kept being true even as she looked harder. It was covered in ivy, thick and old growth, the kind that has had decades to establish itself, the individual leaves dark and overlapping like scales on something armored. But underneath the ivy, her hands could feel the truth of it. A wall, stone at the base, heavy timber above, fitted together with a care and solidity that was entirely intentional. She pulled the ivy away in sheets, tearing it from whatever it had anchored itself to, and underneath was the face of a door. Not a small door, not the kind of door you'd put on a storage shed or a workshop in the ordinary sense of the word. A door 10 feet tall and 8 feet wide, made of the same heavy planks as the cabin door, but reinforced across its face with a grid of iron bars welded at every intersection, with the confidence of someone who built things to outlast himself. In the center of it, a massive iron ring. Below the ring, a keyhole large enough to swallow 3 of her fingers. She stood in front of it for a moment, breathing hard from the climb. Then she pulled the key ring from her pocket, the largest key as her father had written. Long-shanked, heavy, the bidding complex in specific. She inserted it into the lock. It went in smoothly, which surprised her. Whatever mechanism was inside had been built with precision, and even after 13 years in a damp hillside, it received the key the way it was designed to. Turning it was a different matter. She put both hands on the key and applied pressure. Nothing. She tried again, throwing more of her body weight into it, gripping the shaft of the key until the iron edge cut into her palm. The lock did not move. She readjusted her feet, planted them in the wet earth, and tried again. And this time she felt something, not movement, but the suggestion of movement, a micro shift deep in the mechanism, the internal parts beginning to consider her request. She took a breath. She threw every pound she had against it. The crack when the lock finally yielded was enormous in the forest quiet, a deep structural sound like something geological giving way. And then the key turned all the way, one full revolution, and she heard the bolt slide back. She grabbed the iron ring with both hands and pulled. The door did not swing, it scraped. It moved the way something moves that has not moved in a very long time, and has made a kind of peace with its stillness. She pulled until her arms burned and the door came toward her by inches, by fractions of inches, the bottom edge dragging across the stone threshold with a sound like a long, reluctant exhalation. A gap opened. 6 inches, 8, wide enough to turn sideways and slip through. She slipped through. The air inside was different. It was cold, colder even than the forest air outside, with the specific dry cold of a sealed space. And the smell hit her before her eyes had adjusted to anything at all. Iron, coal dust. Something beneath those two things, older, subtler, the ghost of heat that had long since dissipated but left its signature in the stone, in the timber, in the very air of the place. Layered into the silence was a smell she recognized without being able to name it. Something that lived in the oldest part of her memory before language. The smell of her father's hands. That was what she thought standing in the total dark. That was the smell she half remembered from the 1 or 2 fragments she carried from before he was gone. Not a conscious memory, a body memory. The kind that lives in the nervous system rather than the mind and doesn't announce itself until something calls it forward. She waited. The moon coming through the gap in the door behind her gave her just enough to begin to see by. The space was enormous. She had imagined a workshop, a room with a workbench and some tools on hooks, the kind of modest, functional space that a craftsman sets up in a barn or a garage. She had not imagined this. The ceiling rose into darkness she couldn't measure. The floor was stone-fitted in large, irregular slabs that had been laid with care and purpose. The walls, where she could make them out, were lined from floor to whatever height the darkness swallowed them, with tools hanging in organized rows. Hammers. Dozens of hammers ranging from small cross-peen tools, barely larger than her fist, to sledges whose handles were 4 feet long. Tongs with arms like heron legs. Chisels and punches and files and implements she had no names for, yet all hanging in a system that spoke of a person who knew exactly where everything was and could find it without looking. And in the center of the space, on a plinth of solid oak that had been cut and flattened by hand, the anvil. It was massive. She would learn later that it weighed nearly 300 pounds. In the dark, it looked like an altar, which was not entirely wrong. The surface was polished smooth by use, darker at the edges, Where the metal had been worked hardest, the horn extending from one end like a blunt, deliberate finger. She walked toward it and put her hand flat on the face of it. Cold, still, waiting. To the left of the anvil was the hearth, brick and stone built into the far wall 10 feet wide at least, with a firebox that could have held Wren upright inside it with room to spare. The chimney extended above and disappeared into the darkness overhead. Beside the hearth, folded against the wall like a sleeping animal, the bellows. Leather cracked and dry with a wooden frame and a long operating handle. A coal bin against the near wall still held fuel black and dusty and present. She stood in the center of her father's forge and turned slowly, and she understood something she had not fully understood from the letter alone. This was not a hobby. This was not a man who had taken up a craft as a way to pass the time in his mountain exile. The scale of this space, the quality of the tools, the care with which everything had been arranged and maintained, this was the work of a professional of serious ambition and serious skill. Her father had not just been a blacksmith. He had been a master of the form, and he had built this place, this entire cathedral of iron and fire, out here in the trees on the side of a mountain in Harlow County, Oregon, and he had left it for her. She sat down on the stone floor next to the anvil and put her back against its base and stayed there until the light through the door behind her began to change from moon silver to the first gray of approaching dawn. Then she started sweeping. She found the broom against the far wall, its bristles stiff and clogged with years of undisturbed dust. She used it anyway. The act of sweeping was not sophisticated. It required no skill, no knowledge of metalworking, no understanding of anything her father had done in this space. It required only the willingness to pick up a tool and apply it to the problem directly in front of her, one stroke at a time. She swept from the back wall to the front, driving a decade and more of grime toward the door and out into the morning, and then she swept again. She swept until the stone floor was clear enough to show its own pattern. She swept until her arms ached and her back ached, and the interior of the forge was full of the pale morning light that came through the still open door and illuminated the tools on the walls and the face of the anvil and the dark mouth of the hearth. She went back to the cabin and ate cold crackers from her bag, drank water from a tap that remarkably still worked, connected to a gravity-fed pipe from somewhere uphill that her father must have engineered. She slept for 4 hours on the bare bed frame with her jacket as a pillow and the letter folded in her breast pocket where she could feel it against her ribs. When she woke, she went back to the forge and kept working. The first week was the broom and the trash bags and the damp cloth she used on the tools. Not restoration, just excavation. The forge, as she uncovered it, was in better shape than she had any right to expect. The tools were surface rusted in places, but structurally sound, forged from good steel in the old way, thick enough to last generations. The anvil needed only a wire brushing the rust on its surface, coming away to reveal the dark, smooth metal beneath. The bellows needed attention. The leather cracked in 2 places that would let air escape and make the mechanism inefficient. But she found a leather repair kit in a wooden box on one of the shelves, dried and cracked itself, but still functional. And she spent an afternoon on her knees working the conditioner into the old leather and stitching the cracks with the heavy needle and wax thread the kit contained. She also found the journals. They were on a shelf above the workbench on the east wall. 6 of them, leather-covered, different sizes, numbered on the spines in the same firm hand that had written the letter. She brought them to the cabin and read them by the light of a candle she found in the kitchen drawer. She read slowly and carefully, starting with Journal 1 and working forward through the years. Her father's voice came off the pages in a way that was uncomfortable in its immediacy, as if he had written it the week before and left it for her on the kitchen table. He wrote about the forge. He wrote about the properties of different metals, about temperatures and techniques, about the difference between working iron and working steel, and the way each material had its own temperament, its own preferences, its own way of telling you what it was willing to become. He wrote about failures, pieces that hadn't worked, attempts that had cracked or warped or simply refused to cooperate. And he wrote about them without self-pity, with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a man who understood that failure was information. He wrote about successes too, commissions completed, pieces that had come out better than he had planned, Moments in the work when the metal and the heat and the hammer seemed to operate in a kind of agreement that felt he wrote less like making something and more like discovering it. He wrote about her in the fifth journal, sparingly the way men of a certain temperament write about the things that matter most to them, obliquely in small doses, as if the direct approach might be too much weight for the page to hold. But he wrote about her. He wrote that every large piece he made, he thought about her. That he had named one of the hammers the medium cross peen with the hickory handle, the one that felt best balanced for sustained work. He had named it Wren. He did not explain why. He didn't need to. She set the journal down and looked at the hammer hanging on the wall where he had left it, and she did not pick it up yet. She wasn't ready yet. On the second day in the forge, after the broom and before the tools, she found the loose stone. It was exactly where the letter said it would be, on the left side of the hearth, indistinguishable from its neighbors, unless you were looking for something that didn't quite belong. She worked her fingers into the mortar and pulled. The stone came free with a hollow scraping sound, revealing a cavity behind it, dark and dry. Inside sat a metal box smaller than the one she had found under the cabin floor, with a lock that accepted the smallest key on her father's ring. She lifted the lid. The money was there. Old bills stacked in tight bundles, the paper slightly soft at the edges from years in the enclosed space, but intact. She counted it twice, moving through the bundles, methodically setting each to one side on the stone floor. $10,000, exactly as his letter had promised. She sat on the stone floor with her back against the hearth and held the money in her lap for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Not what it could buy, what it meant. He had put it here for her. He had believed she would come. He had planned for her arrival the way you plan for something you are not certain of, but cannot stop hoping for, carefully and without guarantee. And then he had run out of time. She put the money back in the box. She locked it. She carried it to the cabin and put it under the floorboard, where she had found the first metal box in the dark where it would wait. She was not going to decide anything yet. She was going to keep working. She was ready to light the fire on the eighth day. By then, the forge was clean. By then, she had read enough of the journals to understand the basic architecture of the process, how to build the coal fire, how to operate the bellows, the temperature ranges. Her father described the way the metal would communicate its readiness if she learned to read the language of color and sound. She had paid her first visit to town walking the 5 miles in the morning gray and arriving at the hardware store when it opened. The man behind the counter was in his 60s, methodical and unhurried, and he helped her find what she needed without asking many questions, which she appreciated. Work gloves, a new pair of tongs since the old ones needed more work before she could trust them with hot metal. Safety glasses, fire starter. She had also walked to the county administration building and paid the back taxes on the property, $2,412. The clerk, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, had looked at the parcel number and then looked at Wren over the top of the glasses. She said the property had been slated for auction the following month. She said Colt Dunn's name with the ease of someone who remembers a person rather than just a file, the particular familiarity of small-town memory. She said he had been a good man. Quiet, she said, but good. Wren had taken the receipt and folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket and walked out into the thin October sunlight, feeling something she had not felt in a long time. Not happy, not safe, but anchored, like a tent peg driven into solid ground. On the eighth day, she built the fire. She followed her father's instructions from journal one step by step, reading the relevant passages, and then setting the book aside and doing exactly what they described. Kindling first dry wood from the pile inside the forge, then small coal, then larger pieces, building a pyramid in the center of the firebox. She used the bellows to direct air at the base of the kindling while she lit it. The first match went out. The second caught. She pumped the bellows slowly, then with more rhythm, and watched the flame find its confidence spreading from the kindling into the coal at the edges. The coal beginning to glow cherry at first, and then brighter. The roar when the fire fully caught surprised her. She had expected something smaller. What filled the hearth was not small. It was a living, breathing, forceful thing, orange and yellow at the visible edges, white at the heart, the heat of it washing over her face and hands from 6 feet away. The chimney drew the smoke upward, and the forge filled for a few minutes with the acrid smell of coal burning off its impurities, and then began to clear. She stood in front of the fire and felt it, just felt it for a long minute. The heat and the light and the sound of it. The oldest fire there is. Iron Age, Bronze Age, further back than civilization has a clean name for. Human beings had stood in front of forges like this since before writing existed, and had used this fire to make the things that changed the world, tools and weapons and gates and bridges and the hinges on every door. Her father had stood in this exact spot in front of this exact hearth and lit this exact fire. She reached up and took the hammer named for her off its hook. She started with an iron rod, one of a bundle she had found in the back of the forge, round stock, 3/8 of an inch, the diameter her father recommended for beginning work in Journal 1. She clamped it in the tongs and put it in the fire and watched the color change first, the dull black warming to brown, then to a red that brightened as the heat climbed, then to orange, then, at the point her father described as working heat, to a yellow-white that made her eyes want to look away. She pulled it from the fire and carried it to the anvil. She swung the hammer. It went badly. The rod twisted. The hammer glanced off the working surface. A shower of sparks erupted from the contact point, and she flinched away, losing the rhythm before it had started, and the rod fell to the floor hissing against the damp stone. She picked it up with the tongs, put it back in the fire, and tried again. Same result. She tried again. The rod began to accumulate the marks of her failures along its length, pits and divots and irregular compressions that had no plan behind them, evidence of effort without direction. She put it back in the fire and read the relevant section of Journal 1 while she waited for the heat to climb. Her father had written, "The hammer does not force. It suggests. You are not trying to beat the metal into submission. You are having a conversation with it. Listen to the sound of each strike. A good strike on hot metal has a ring to it, clear and bright. A poor strike is dull. Let the sound teach you." She tried again. It went badly again. She tried again. By the end of that first day at the fire, her arms were exhausted to the point of a deep structural fatigue she had never experienced from waitressing or any of the other physical work she'd done. Her hands, even through the gloves, had blisters forming at the base of every finger. She had produced nothing she could show anyone, a collection of bent and irregular iron pieces that belonged in the scrap bin, which her father had helpfully labeled in Journal 1 with a line she read that night by candlelight. "The first 100 are for the scrap pile. The 101st is for you. Don't count them and don't be discouraged by them. They are not failures. They are tuition. Pay them and move on." She went back the next day. She was on her third morning at the fire when the truck came. She heard it before she saw it. An engine that had decades on it, rough and idle, the sound of a vehicle that has earned its character through use. She stepped out of the forge into the morning light and shaded her eyes. At the edge of the clearing, an old pickup truck, dark green and practical, had stopped. The driver's door opened and a man got out. He was old. Not frail old, not diminished old. The kind of old that accumulates slowly in people who have spent their lives doing physical work, so that by their 70s they have become something dense and specific, their bodies shaped by decades of demand into something that has more in common with the landscape than with the people who only visit it. He was tall, with a broad chest that had settled some with age, but not much. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who have spent more time outside than in the skin of it, mapped with the evidence of sun and weather and years. His eyes, when he was close enough for her to see them, were pale gray and direct. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the smoke rising from the forge chimney for a moment before he looked at her. "Been 13 years since I saw smoke from that stack," he said. His voice was a low, flat Oregon voice, economical with its syllables, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that most things worth saying didn't require many words. "I'm sorry if it disturbed you," Wren said. He shook his head. "Didn't say it disturbed me." He looked at her again, the same direct appraisal he had given the chimney smoke. "You're Colt's girl." It was not a question. Ren done, she said. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already concluded before he drove down from the ridge. Harding Kessler, I'm over the ridge north side. Been there my whole life. He looked at the forge again at the open door at the smoke. Your dad and I weren't close, but I knew him. Watched him build that forge over the course of a summer. Watched him work out of it for 2 years before. He stopped, started again. Before. Before the accident, she said. Yes. They looked at each other across the clearing. There was something in his face that she couldn't fully read, some layered thing that had settled there over a long time and become part of the architecture of his expression. Not grief exactly, but the residue of it. The way a river reshapes the banks it flows through, and the shape remains long after the water level drops. Do you want to come in, she said. I have coffee. It's not good coffee, but it's hot. He came in. He sat in the chair at the table where her father had once sat, and he accepted the coffee without comment and drank it without complaint about its quality, which was legitimately poor. He looked around the cabin with the eyes of someone who had been here before, who remembered it as it had been, and was quietly noting the ways it had changed. He told her about Colt Dunn, the way people tell stories about the dead, when they've had a long time to arrange the material and have been waiting without quite knowing it for someone with the right to hear it. Not chronologically, in the order of what mattered. He told her about watching Colt work at the forge on the days when Hardin had come over to help with some shared task on the property line, the way Colt moved around the anvil with a kind of quiet certainty. No wasted motion. Every action purposeful and connected to the one before and after it. He told her about the pieces he had made that Hardin had seen gates and architectural elements mostly, and one piece that Hardin described as a tree made of iron life-size. Every branch and twig formed individually and then welded together, which Colt had sold to a client in Portland for more money than Hardin had made in a year of timber work. He told her about the hinges Colt had made for his barn doors hand-forged, still swinging true after all this time, moving as cleanly on their pins as the day they were installed. And then he told her about the last commission. He told it the way he told everything straight and without embellishment. Toward the end, in the final months before the accident, Colt had taken on the largest single commission of his career. A family in Portland old money, the kind that had been accumulating in the Pacific Northwest since the timber era, when the trees were so large and so numerous that fortunes could be built simply by having the right equipment and the will to use it. The Aldrich family. They wanted a set of gates for the entrance to their estate property outside the city, something significant, something that would be a piece of serious art rather than just functional ironwork. Colt had designed them. Hardin had seen the drawings pages of them, organic forms that moved the way living things move branches, and vines rendered in iron with a fidelity to nature that seemed impossible in a material so rigid. The Aldrich family had paid a deposit, $40,000. Colt had started the work. And then winter came, Hardin said. He held his coffee cup in both hands. January, ice on the county road. You know the rest. The gates, Wren said. Hardin looked at her. Were they finished? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I never saw them after. I assumed they were lost with everything else, or maybe he'd never gotten far enough along with them. The Aldrich family, I imagine they wrote off the deposit years ago. He paused. Or maybe they didn't. I don't know. Wren looked at the door of the cabin as if she could see through it, and across the clearing and into the forge past the main space, and into the storage room in the back, the room with the heavy door and the second key on her father's ring. She had noticed it on the first night and had not opened. It had been focused on the main space on the broom and the hearth in the beginning of her education. She had not yet opened the back room. After Hardin left, she sat for a while in the cabin and thought about $40,000 paid as a deposit on a commission that had never been delivered. She thought about a man who had started building something magnificent, knowing that he might not be there to finish it, and who had sealed the unfinished work in a room with a key on a ring that he left for his daughter. She thought about the note she hadn't yet found that said, "Finish it." She sat with all of that until the light outside began to change and the cold pressed harder against the cabin walls. The following week, after Hardin had come and gone twice more, after she had made her 40th bad piece of iron and started on the 41st, she stood in front of the back room door with the second key in her hand. She unlocked it. She pulled it open. The room beyond was smaller than the main forge, maybe 20 feet by 15. No windows. She held up the lantern she had bought in town and swung it slowly around the perimeter. The floor was clear stone swept clean. On the shelves along the right wall, boxes of materials and specialized supplies, each labeled in her father's hand. On the left wall, hooks holding more specialized tools than were in the main space, things for finer work. And in the center of the room, taking up most of the floor space, covered in canvas tarps that had been oiled against moisture and were still remarkably intact, something large, very large. She set the lantern on the nearest shelf and began pulling the tarps away. It took her several minutes to uncover it fully. The first panel came into view and she stopped. The second. She stopped again. She pulled the last tarp to the floor and stood back as far as the room would allow and looked at what her father had left in the dark. The gates were not finished. He had told her that they wouldn't be, but they were further along than unfinished implied, further along than the word suggested. Two panels, each one 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, leaning against the back wall on custom-made stands that he had built to hold them. The design was what stopped her breath and held it. The iron had been worked into forms that the word ironwork did not fully contain, not the geometric regularity of traditional gates. Something organic and alive, stems and branches moving through the panels with the logic of actual growth. 100 individual pieces forged, welded together into a composition that had the density and the coherence of something found in nature rather than fabricated by human hands. The surface texture varied, hammered smooth in some places, deliberately rough in others. The iron itself catching the lantern light differently at every angle so that the whole thing seemed to shift and breathe as she moved the light. She stood in front of them for a long time. She was not an art critic. She had no formal vocabulary for what she was looking at. She only knew that she was looking at something made by a man who understood his material the way a musician understands pitch, not as an intellectual proposition, but as a bodily fact, and that the work in front of her was the work of someone operating at the height of his ability, making the best thing he had ever made and had not been allowed to finish. On the floor beside the left panel, a tin sealed. She opened it. Inside rolled carefully a set of drawings. The full design rendered in pencil on heavy paper, every element specified, every measurement noted in the same firm hand. A note in the lower corner, 80% complete, remaining upper scrollwork central medallion, final patination. See Journal 6 for specifications. Underneath the drawings, the contract, the Aldrich Family Trust, signed by her father and countersigned, dated 13 years ago. Commission value $80,000. Deposit received $40,000. Balance due upon delivery $40,000. Underneath the contract, a note, not addressed to her, written to himself or to whoever might eventually open this room. In the same firm hand, the same ink, the same careful pressure. Finish it. She re-rolled the drawings and put them back in the tin. She put the tin carefully back in its place on the floor. She looked at the gates for another long moment. The lantern light moved over the iron surface. The shadow shifted. The branches in the metalwork seemed in that unsteady light to move very slightly, the way branches move in a gentle wind, as if the thing was already half alive and was waiting only for someone to come and breathe the rest of it into being. She picked up the lantern. She went back to the main forge and stood in front of the fire that was still burning, its coals glowing deep orange in the hearth. She picked up the hammer. She had 100 more bad pieces to make before she was ready for the gates. Probably more than 100. The gates were 9 months away from her hands, maybe more, maybe much more. Maybe she would never be good enough to finish them the way her father would have finished them. But she was going to learn. She was going to read every page of every journal. She was going to work this hearth every day until her body understood the relationship between fire and iron the way it understood breathing. She was going to earn the right to stand in front of those gates with a hammer in her hand. And then she was going to finish what her father had started. The hammer came down on the iron. The ring of it filled the forge clear and bright, and in the brightness of that sound she could hear if she listened. With the right part of herself, something that was almost like an answer. A letter from Ridgeback Development arrived at the Oak Ridge post office in the second week, forwarded to her general delivery. The clerk handed it to her without expression, a cream-colored envelope with a Portland return address and a logo in the upper left corner, a stylized mountain ridgeline above the company name. She read it standing on the post office steps. It was from a Dana Krebs, Senior Acquisitions Manager. It was precise and professional and friendly in the specific way of correspondence designed to obscure its own agenda. They had become aware that Parcel 7 Section 12 Township 34 South was recently transferred to active ownership. They were a development company with interests in the Harlow County area. They were prepared to make a very generous offer. The number at the bottom of the first page was $75,000. She read it twice. She turned the letter over as if there might be something on the back that would explain it. There was nothing on the back. She walked home with the letter in her jacket pocket and the particular cold attention in her chest that she had learned over the last 2 years to pay careful attention to. Not anxiety, something more precise than anxiety. The specific alertness that comes when something doesn't add up, and the part of your brain responsible for arithmetic is running the numbers quietly while the rest of you tries to appear normal. The land had been valued by everyone who had ever looked at it at somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. She had been told this repeatedly. The back taxes had been allowed to accumulate for years without anyone considering the property worth fighting over. And now, within weeks of her asserting ownership and paying those taxes, a development company in Portland was offering 9 times the assessed value. Who had told them? She took the library bus into town. The Oak Ridge Branch Library had 3 computers and a part-time reference librarian who pointed her to the legal research databases without asking why someone her age wanted them. She spent 4 hours there. She was not a lawyer. She had no formal training in reading corporate filings or real estate documents. But she was careful and patient, and the internet, given enough time and the right search terms, gives up a great deal of information about who owns what and who owns the companies that own what. Ridgeback Development, LLC, registered in Oregon principal office in Portland. 2 named members, a holding company called Cascade Ridge Partners, and a smaller stake, 17% listed to a company called MHK Consulting Group. She looked up MHK Consulting Group, a shell company, barely a page of results, registered 2 years ago. Principal Miriam Hollis Krebs. Krebs, the name on the letter. Dana Krebs, Senior Acquisitions Manager. She sat back in the library chair and let the pieces settle into their arrangement. Miriam Hollis's maiden name she had heard once in passing from Garrett was Krebs. Dana Krebs, an employee, a relative, someone from the family's orbit, reaching out with a company her mother had a stake in for land that Miriam had known about for at least 2 years. Land she had identified in her own handwriting in the note Wren had found behind the kitchen drawer liner, the note dated before Garrett had ever walked into the community center. They had not just taken the insurance money. That had been the beginning, not the entirety. The insurance money was the down payment on a longer plan. Acquire the cash asset, then acquire the land asset. Get the girl to sign the money over, wait for her to give up and sell the land, or wait for her to abandon it and let it revert to the county, at which point someone with knowledge and resources and connections to the right people in the right offices might acquire it very cheaply. What they knew about the land that justified $75,000, she didn't know. Timber rights, mineral access, a broader parcel assembly that made her 5 acres the keystone of something much larger. She didn't need to know the details. She needed to know only one thing, which was that the same people who had taken her mother's money were now reaching for her father's land. She closed the browser and sat for a moment. Then she took out a piece of paper and wrote a brief letter. She thanked Ridgeback Development for their interest. She informed them that the property was not for sale. She signed it Wren Dunn, and under her name she wrote owner. She mailed it from the post office counter on her way out. The walk home was 5 miles of gravel road through the trees, And she walked all of it without stopping, moving at a pace that came from somewhere internal, from the cold, clear anger that had replaced the diffuse grief and helplessness of the bus station. She was not the girl who had stood in the hallway on her birthday and breathed carefully so she wouldn't fall apart in public. That girl was less than 2 months ago and several lifetimes distant. She walked 5 miles of mountain road in the cold October afternoon, and when she arrived back at the forge, she lit the fire and picked up the hammer and worked until her arms gave out entirely. Winter came to Harlow County the way it comes to mountain country. Not gradually, but with the sudden authority of something that has been waiting just beyond the tree line and has finally decided to stop waiting. One morning in November, Wren woke to find the clearing white, the firs heavy with new snow. The world outside the cabin window reduced to a silence so complete it had its own texture, a density of quiet she had never experienced in the city. The forge chimney left a dark trail against the gray sky. She dressed in 2 layers, pulled on her boots, and went to light the fire. She had been on the property for just over 2 months. Her hands were different now. She noticed this sometimes when she looked at them, the way you notice gradual changes in a face you see every day, only registering the accumulation when something makes you stop and look directly. The blisters from the first week had healed and hardened. The palms had thickened. There were small scars at the base of her right thumb and along the outer edge of her left hand where sparks had landed and she had not moved fast enough. Her grip was stronger. She could feel it in the way she held her coffee cup in the mornings, in the way she lifted things that would have required 2 hands 6 weeks ago. The work had changed too, not transformed, not yet, but changed in the incremental way that real learning changes things, without announcement, without the dramatic moment of sudden competence that she had half expected, and that the reality of skill acquisition had refused to provide. She had made bad pieces and worse pieces, and then slightly less bad pieces, and then slowly pieces that were still imperfect, but were imperfect in ways she could understand and identify and work toward correcting. She had made hooks, hooks in different sizes with different curves, some functional and some not. She had made a simple latch, then a better one. She had made a small hinge that worked, that actually bore weight and moved as a hinge should move, and she had held it in the light of the forge for a long time before she put it on the shelf beside the anvil where she kept the things she considered worth keeping. Hardin came over the ridge every 2 or 3 days. He always arrived with a reason, a tool. He was returning a question about the property line, information about the county road conditions, whether the lower section would be passable after the first real snow. These reasons were largely pretextual, which they both understood and neither acknowledged directly. He would sit in the chair he had claimed in the corner of the forge, near enough to the hearth to benefit from its heat, and he would watch her work and he would talk. He talked about Colt the way you talk about someone when you have been carrying their memory alone for a long time and have finally found a person with the right to share the weight of it. He was careful with the stories. He chose them deliberately, giving her the ones she needed, not just the ones that were easy to tell. He told her about her father's stubbornness, the way Colt would work a piece for days if it wasn't right, unwilling to accept the almost. He told her about his humor, which was dry and infrequent, and therefore landed harder when it came. He told her about the winter her father had spent redesigning the bellows mechanism because the original configuration wasn't drawing quite the way he wanted a month of work to achieve an improvement that most smiths would never have noticed or cared about. She listened while she worked. The stories entered her through a different door than the journals had, less technical, more human filling, in the space between the written lines, with the texture of a real person who had existed in real time, who had been cold in winters and frustrated on difficult work days and quietly pleased with himself on good ones. She was working on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of November, a set of simple wall hooks for Hardin that she was making as close to identical as she could manage when she heard the sound of a car on the track. Not Hardin's truck. The engine was too smooth, too new, too much the sound of a vehicle that had never been asked to do anything difficult. She set down the tongs and walked to the forge entrance and looked across the clearing. A dark sedan. Portland plates. The driver's door opened and Garrett Hollis got out. She had known in a loose and theoretical way that this was a possibility. She had known it the way you know about weather, understanding that certain conditions make certain outcomes probable without knowing exactly when. When she had mailed the refusal letter to Ridgeback Development, she had understood that refusal was not the same as resolution. The people who had put 2 years of planning into taking what was hers were unlikely to accept a politely worded no and redirect their attention elsewhere. She had not spent time imagining this specific moment. She had been too busy working. He looked the same. This was her first coherent thought, watching him walk across the clearing toward her hands in the pockets of a jacket that was far too light for this weather, the kind of jacket you wear when you're planning to be inside most of the day. He looked exactly the same as he had in the hallway of the apartment on her birthday. The same easy gait, the same particular arrangement of his features that could produce on demand, an expression of warmth or concern or patience as the situation required. He looked around the clearing with an expression of calibrated appreciation. "You actually stayed," he said. She said nothing. "I heard you'd been out here." He stopped about 10 feet from her. "I wasn't sure I believed it, that you'd actually choose a falling down cabin in the middle of nowhere over a fresh start somewhere else." "I'm working," she said. "I can see that." He looked at her hands, at the work gloves, at the smudge of coal dust on her forearm. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt. Something more complicated than guilt and less honest than regret. The look of a person recalibrating, running new numbers on a situation that has not developed the way it was supposed to. "Ren, I think we should talk." "About what?" "About this." He gestured at the property, the gesture encompassing the cabin and the forge and the trees and the clearing, reducing it all with the economy of a single motion to a real estate problem. "There's an offer on the table, a serious offer. I want to make sure you understand what you're walking away from." She looked at him for a moment. She had spent 2 months working iron. She had spent 2 months learning to read what a piece of metal was telling her by the sound it made when the hammer came down. She could hear in the quality of what he was saying the same things she had learned to hear in the work. The dull sound of a strike that was not connecting properly. The sound of something that was not quite right at its foundation. "Come inside," she said. She led him not to the cabin but to the forge. She held the door open and he stepped through it and stopped. She watched him take in the space, the scale of it, the tools on the walls, the anvil, the hearth where the fire was burning low. She watched his eyes move, and she watched them find the gates through the open door of the back room, which she had left open that morning. The canvas tarps were off. The panels stood against the back wall of the storage room, visible from where he stood, the lantern light catching the iron surface. She watched him see them, watched him understand at least partially what he was looking at, watched the calculation happen behind his face. "The property isn't for sale," she said. "That hasn't changed." He turned back to her. The recalibration was almost visible. He shifted registers, moved from the business approach to something warmer, more personal. She recognized the shift the way you recognize a card trick when you have seen it performed on you before. "I'm not just here about the property," he said. "I was worried about you. You disappeared. You didn't tell anyone where you were going." "I told you where I was going," she said. "You thought it was worthless." Something flickered. He pressed it back down. "Ren, I know things ended badly between us. I know you're angry, but you're 18. You can't live out here forever working a forge that hasn't been used in 13 years. This is grief. This is you trying to hold on to something because you lost so much. I understand that, but this isn't a real plan." She reached into her jacket pocket. She set the piece of paper on the workbench beside her. She did not slide it toward him. She simply placed it flat on the surface where he could see it. He looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that she knew he recognized it. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was stripped of performance, the voice of someone who has stopped producing an effect and has reverted to a baseline. "Behind the kitchen drawer liner," she said. "The one in the apartment. You should have looked more carefully before you showed me out." The note lay between them, his mother's handwriting, her name, the insurance figure, the parcel number, dated 3 months before they met. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through options, testing possibilities, looking for the angle that still worked. He found none. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "It proves your mother knew about my mother's insurance before you walked into that community center," Wren said. "It proves that the money and the land were both identified before I ever met you. It proves that what you told me about helping me was a script you'd written before you knew my name." Silence. "I have a lawyer," she said, "a legal aid attorney at the county library who has been looking at the power of attorney documents you had me sign. She had a handwriting expert look at some of the signatures." She paused. "Not all of them are mine." Something changed in his face. A small change, a tightening around the jaw, a shift in the eyes that was the first genuinely unmanaged thing she had ever seen in his expression. "I'm not going to file criminal charges," she said. "The attorney thinks we could make a case, but it would take time and money and energy that I'd rather spend on other things." She nodded toward the forge, toward the fire, toward the gates in the back room. "What I am going to do is file the civil suit we've already prepared. Fraudulent misrepresentation, unjust enrichment, the forged signatures, your mother's company's stake in Ridgeback." She looked at him steadily. "Or you can settle. $15,000. Your mother's lawyers can make it happen in a week. In exchange, I don't file and I don't talk to anyone about any of this, and you and your family leave me alone." He stared at her. She waited. She had learned at the forge that waiting was its own kind of force, that patience applied steadily in the right direction was as powerful as any hammer blow. She waited the way the iron waited in the fire, without agitation, without hurry, simply present and ready for what came next. 15,000, he said finally. 15,000, she confirmed. By the end of the month. He looked around the forge one more time, at the anvil, at the gates visible in the back room, at the woman standing in front of the hearth with coal dust on her arms and no particular expression on her face, none of the emotions he had prepared responses for, no anger he could redirect and no grief he could exploit. He looked at all of it as if he was trying to find in it something he could still use, some angle he hadn't tried. He found nothing. He left. She stood in the forge entrance and watched the dark sedan move back down the track through the trees until the sound of its engine was entirely gone and the silence of the mountain had filled back in behind it, complete and indifferent and entirely unchanged by his presence or his departure. She stood there for another moment, breathing the cold air, feeling the heat of the forge at her back. Then she went inside and put another shovel of coal on the fire and picked up the hammer and went back to work. The settlement arrived by wire transfer on the 28th day. $15,000 exactly as agreed. No accompanying note, no acknowledgement of anything beyond the number itself. She transferred $2,500 to cover the next year's property taxes in advance. The rest she set aside with the same careful portion thinking she had applied to the original $10,000 from her father's hiding place. Materials, tools that needed replacing, the contingencies that mountain living in a property this old makes inevitable regardless of planning. She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel triumphant, and she didn't, which surprised her until she thought about it long enough to understand. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. She felt like someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying for so long that they had stopped noticing the weight itself and has had a moment to register what their body feels like without it. Not celebration, relief. The specific relief of a thing that is finished and will not need to be done again. December brought harder cold and shorter days. She adapted her schedule to the light starting earlier and finishing before the early dark made the walk between the cabin and the forge treacherous. Hardin brought her a bag of rock salt for the path without being asked. He also brought her one afternoon a paper bag of groceries that he set on the cabin table without comment, refusing the money she tried to give him with a single wave of his hand that closed the subject permanently. She worked on the gates through December, but not with her hammer. Not yet. She worked on them with her father's journals, in her eyes, in the drawings she had found in the tin. She studied the completed sections, learning the vocabulary of the design, the way each branch connected to its source. The angles of growth governed not by geometry, but by botany, by the same logic that actual trees use when they decide how to reach toward light. She traced the forms with her finger, hovering a quarter inch above the surface, following the lines without touching. She read Journal 6 front to back and then again. She made drawings of her own, tentative and imprecise at first, and then more confident, trying to extend the design into the unfinished sections, to follow her father's thinking forward into the territory he had not reached. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, she made her first piece of the gate. It was a single branch, 12 inches long, 3/4 inch stalk, tapering from the base to a point that curved slightly to the left. The kind of small terminal branch that appears at the outer edges of the composition background detail in the overall design. She forged it and heated it and worked the taper on the anvil horn and refined the curve over the edge of the anvil face, checking it against her drawing at intervals, reheating when the metal stiffened and resisted. She worked it for 3 hours. When it was done, she held it against the edge of the gate panel at the point where it would eventually be welded into place. She looked at the junction, at the way her piece met her father's work. She looked at it for a long time. She thought it might be all right. She put it on the shelf with the other things she considered worth keeping. January, February. She fell into the rhythm of the work, the way you fall into something you were shaped for without knowing it, the shape of the work and the shape of your capacity, meeting along a line that surprises you with its precision. She was not her father. She understood this clearly and without distress. Her technique was cruder, her eye less developed, her speed a fraction of what his journals described. But she was learning in the way that real learning happens when you have good material and no other option, deeply and without detour, each day building on the last with the compounding logic of practice skill. Hardin watched her work and said very little. Occasionally he would say something about a piece she had just made, a single sentence, always comparative. That taper's better than last week's. The previous one had a twist in the cooling she hadn't caught. These were not compliments. They were observations, which was more useful. When she finished the third gate branch and held it up in the forge light, he looked at it for a long time and said, "Your father held his tongs the same way. Left hand higher on the grip." She looked at her hands and did not say anything and went back to the fire. She called the Aldrich family in March. She had been thinking about how to do it since January and had not done it, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to be certain first. Certain that she understood the gates well enough to speak about them with authority. Certain that she could describe what remained to be done and how she intended to do it without sounding like someone improvising a case for something she wasn't sure of herself. She spent 2 months becoming certain. Then she called. The phone was answered by a woman named Carolyn Aldrich, who turned out to be the granddaughter of the man who had commissioned the gates, the original client now in his 80s and no longer managing family business. Caroline Aldrich was in her late 40s, composed and careful on the phone, exactly what you would expect from someone who had spent her adult life managing old money and the weight of responsibility that comes with it. She listened without interrupting. Wren told her about the property, about arriving, about finding the forge and the journals and the gates in the back room. She described the gates with as much precision as she could, the dimensions, the design, the state of completion. She read from the contract the commission value, the deposit figure, the balance due upon delivery. She told Caroline Aldrich that she was Colt Dunn's daughter and that she had been working in the forge for 5 months and that she believed she could finish the gates. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. "I need to see them," Caroline Aldrich said finally. "Can I come to you?" Caroline Aldrich arrived on a Thursday in late March with a woman she introduced as her assistant and a man she didn't introduce who turned out to be a structural engineer. They drove a large black SUV down the track with more confidence than Wren had expected and parked at the edge of the clearing without visible distress at the remoteness of the location. Wren took them to the forge. She opened the back room and stood aside and let them look. Caroline Aldrich stood in front of the gates for a long time. She walked the length of both panels. She crouched to look at the lower sections. She stood on her toes to examine the upper work. She did not speak for nearly 10 minutes, and Wren did not speak either, understanding that this silence was not absence but presence, the presence of someone looking seriously at something they were taking seriously. Finally, Carolyn Aldrich turned. Her face had the quality of someone who has just had something confirmed that they had half believed for a long time, but had not allowed themselves to fully accept. My grandfather has had photographs of the preliminary designs for 13 years, she said. He never stopped considering this commission active. He never asked for the deposit back. He told us once that the work would come when it was ready. She looked at the gates again. I think he meant something spiritual by that. I'm not sure he meant it literally. I've been working on the remaining sections, Wren said. She brought out her drawings, the extensions of her father's design that she had been developing through January and February and into March. She laid them on the workbench. She showed Caroline the branch she had made in December and the pieces she had made since, each one an exercise in the vocabulary of the design, building her fluency. She showed her Journal 6 and the specifications her father had left. Carolyn Aldrich looked at the drawings for a long time. She looked at the finished pieces on the shelf. "These are your work," she said, pointing to the shelf. "Not your father's." "Yes." "They're good," she said. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment delivered with the directness of someone who had spent enough time around serious work to call it accurately. She looked at Wren. "How long to finish?" Wren had thought about this carefully, accounting for her current pace, for the complexity of the remaining sections, for the time she would need to learn the forge welding technique the junction points required, which was the highest demand skill in the entire project, and the one she had been working toward building all winter. 8 months, she said. "If everything goes the way I expect." "Possibly 10. Caroline nodded. "The original contract stands," she said. "The deposit was paid. The balance of $40,000 is due on delivery. We'd like to add a completion fee on top of the contract value for your work, specifically as the craftsperson completing the commission." She named a figure, another $40,000. Wren stood very still. "The total value of the gates, given what my grandfather originally paid and what we know now about your father's work, is substantially more than the contract price," Caroline said, in the matter-of-fact way of someone for whom large numbers are simply units of account rather than objects of emotion. "We're not doing you a favor. We're correcting an undervaluation that was always an artifact of the commission's age." Wren looked at the gates, at the panels leaning against the back wall in the lantern light, the iron forms reaching and branching and growing toward a completion that had been waiting 13 years. She looked at the shelf with her pieces on it. She looked at the journals stacked on the workbench, 6 of them, her father's handwriting filling the pages from cover to cover, his voice in every line. She thought about Garrett Hollis and his mother and the note behind the kitchen drawer liner. She thought about the bus station at 3 in the morning. She thought about the girl who had stood in a hallway on her birthday and breathed carefully so she wouldn't fall apart. And she felt the distance between that girl and the woman standing in this forge as something almost geographical, as if the 5 months were not months but miles, as if she had walked here from there, and the ground between them was real ground that she had actually crossed step by step in the cold and the dark. "All right," she said. She worked through spring and into summer with an intensity that reorganized her entire existence around the problem of the gates. She was up before light and in the forge by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She worked until the light failed. She ate at the workbench, reading Journal 6. She slept quickly and completely and woke ready. The days had the quality of something she had not experienced before, a convergence between what she was doing and what she was capable of, a sense of operating at the outer edge of her current ability and finding that edge moving, retreating before her, the way a horizon retreats when you walk toward it, but continues to exist, continues to pull you forward. Hardin came every 2 days without fail. He no longer pretended to have reasons. He came, he sat, he watched. Occasionally he handed her a tool before she reached for it, having anticipated what she needed, with the ease of someone who had spent 1,000 hours watching a blacksmith work and had internalized the grammar of the process. She did not thank him for this. It would have embarrassed them both. In June, she learned forge welding. It was the hardest thing she had learned in 5 months of hard learning. The technique required heating two pieces of iron to a temperature above the normal working range to a near liquid brightness where the metal became briefly willing to fuse with another piece of itself, and then striking at precisely the right moment with exactly the right force before the heat dropped below the threshold. The margin was seconds. The penalty for mistiming was a weld that held visually but was structurally compromised, a failure that could take years to reveal itself. She made 47 failed welds before she made one that was right. The 48th weld connected the first new branch to the gate panel. She held the panel in the light after the metal had cooled and ran her finger along the junction, the point where her work met her father's. The line between them was there if you were looking for it. If you weren't, it was simply part of the whole, a continuation. Not a repair, but an extension as natural as a tree adding a new season's growth to what was already there. She allowed herself to feel that for exactly 1 minute. Then she went back to the fire. Hardin came over the ridge on a Tuesday in late September earlier than usual, before she had finished lighting the forge for the morning. He had a paper bag from the bakery in town which he set on the workbench without comment. Inside were 2 coffees and a pair of pastries that she suspected he had never bought for himself in his life, that he had gone out of his way to acquire because he had decided in his minimal and unannounced way that today called for something beyond the ordinary. They sat and drank the coffee without talking, which was one of the things she had come to value about Hardin Kessler. His comfort with silence, the way he could be present in a room without requiring the room to acknowledge him. "You're close," he said eventually. "6 weeks," she said. "Maybe 8." He nodded. He looked at the back room at the panels which she had moved to the main forge so she could work on them in better light. They were nearly unrecognizable from the winter-stored forms she had first uncovered under the canvas. The upper sections were filled now, the scroll work in place, the forms reaching toward each other across the divide between the two panels with the specific purposefulness that her father's design had always intended. The central medallion was half done, the most demanding piece of the entire composition, a circular form at the juncture point of the panels that her father's drawing specified in the greatest detail. Hardin looked at the panels for a long time. "Your father made the hinges on my barn doors," he said. 32 years ago, maybe 33, before you were born." He paused. "They're still swinging true. Every single day I open those doors and they move like they did when he first put them on." He held his coffee cup in both hands. "There's a kind of work that lasts," he said, "and there's work that doesn't. The difference isn't in the material, it's in the person doing it, whether they're paying attention to what the work actually is." He looked at her. Colt was paying attention. "That's why the hinges still swing." He nodded at the gates. "You're paying attention." He did not say anything else. He finished his coffee and folded the paper bag neatly and put it in the trash bin by the door and drove back over the ridge in his old truck. She sat for a moment after the sound of his engine faded, just sat in the quiet of the forge with the fire burning and the gate standing against the wall and the journals on the shelf and everything her father had built around her, holding her the way good walls hold against weather. Then she picked up her hammer. The gates were finished on the 15th of October, 1 year and 17 days after she had stepped off a bus in Oak Ridge with $200 in a manila envelope. She finished the last element of the central medallion in the morning and set down her hammer and stood back and looked at the complete work. They were 8 feet tall. Both panels together were 8 feet wide. The iron forms moved through them the way her father had drawn them, the way living things move with the logic of growth and the evidence of time and the particular authority of something that has been made with full attention by someone who understood their material at the level of intuition. Her sections were in them, her welds, her branches, her scroll work, her half of the central medallion. The seams between her work and her father's work were there, visible to her, invisible to anyone who did not know to look. The gates were one thing. They had always been meant to be one thing. She called Caroline Aldrich. She said 3 words. "They're ready. Come." Caroline Aldrich arrived 3 days later with a flatbed truck and two men who specialized in moving large ironwork. They loaded the panels with the careful, practiced efficiency of professionals strapping them into custom cradles, protecting the surface with moving blankets. Wren watched from the edge of the clearing. She watched the truck until it disappeared around the first bend in the track. Then the trees closed over the gap and the clearing was quiet again, and all she felt was the cold at her back and the heat of the forge behind her, and she understood that this was what completion felt like. Not empty, not triumphant, simply done. The way a thing feels when it has arrived where it was always going. Before the truck had left, Caroline Aldrich had handed her two envelopes. The first contained the balance of the original contract plus the completion fee. The second was smaller, and Carolyn said it was from her grandfather. Wren opened it after the truck was gone. Inside was a card in an old man's careful, diminished handwriting. The letters formed slowly and with effort, but still precise, still legible, the handwriting of someone who was still paying attention. He had waited 13 years for these gates, and they had arrived. He did not have words adequate to what he wanted to say. He said only this: your father made things that lasted. He hoped she understood that she did too. He would like to come see the forge sometime if she would allow it, because he had always wanted to see where the work came from. She folded the card carefully and put it in the wooden chest with her father's letter and the locket and the ring of keys. She closed the lid. That Saturday, she drove Hardin's truck into Oak Ridge because Hardin had given her the keys without being asked when she mentioned she wanted to go to the farmer's market. The market was a modest affair in the parking lot behind the hardware store, 20 or so vendors in varying states of weatherproofing against the October morning. She set up a folding table and laid out the pieces she had been making alongside the gatework. The items she made to keep her hands busy on the days when the gatework needed rest. Hooks, hinges, fireplace tools, a set of wall brackets. A small candle holder she had made to test a forming technique and liked enough to keep. Hardin was there at 8 in the morning before she had finished setting up. He looked at the table and picked up the set of wall hooks, 3 of them graduated in size. "What are these going for?" he said. She told him. He reached in his pocket and paid her in cash without negotiating what she suspected he considered a point of personal ethics. The ethics of a man who believes that good work should be paid for at the price asked. He took the hooks and put them in his jacket pocket and stood at the edge of her table for the rest of the morning. And whenever anyone stopped to look, he talked about what they were looking at with the straightforward authority of someone who actually knew. He said Colt Dunn's girl made these. He said the work was done on Colt Dunn's forge up on the ridge. He said if you knew Colt's work, and some of them did, long-term residents of Harlow County who remembered, you would see it in the pieces. She sold everything she had brought. The article came out in December in an architectural journal that Caroline Aldrich had contacted after the gates were installed at the Aldrich property. It told the story in the way that good writing about craft tells stories through the material and the work and the specific human decisions that produce them. It was careful with the facts. It named Colt Dunn and described his career with the respect due a craftsman of serious ability who had not been sufficiently recognized in his time. It described the gates as they were now installed, and it described the 13-year gap and the daughter who had arrived and learned the forge and finished the work. There was a photograph of the gates in their setting, the iron forms against the stone pillars, the branches reaching. There was a smaller photograph of Wren at the anvil taken by Caroline's photographer on the day the gates were loaded, the forge fire visible in the background, the hammer in her hand. Her phone number, which she had published for business inquiries, rang for 3 weeks after the article appeared. She answered some of the calls and returned the others when she had time, which was not always. There was a commission from a restaurant in Portland that wanted custom hardware. There was an inquiry from a residential architect in Eugene about decorative elements for a private home. There was a letter from a woman in Asheville, North Carolina, who had seen the article and whose late husband had been a blacksmith, and who simply wanted to say that she understood something about the story that wasn't in the words. Something that you can only understand if you have lived close to that kind of work and know what it costs and what it gives back. Wren answered the Asheville letter by hand on paper the way her father had written to her. Garrett Hollis did not call. His mother did not reach out. Ridgeback Development did not send another letter. The world they occupied and the world she occupied had separated in the way of things that have been cut cleanly and given time to heal. She did not think about them often. When she did, it was briefly and without heat, the way you think about a storm that has passed, that reshaped the landscape while it was happening, and then moved on, and that you no longer have any reason to expect to return. The forge was warm in the evenings, even as the second winter came down from the mountains and pressed its weight against the valley. She kept the fire going past dark, working on the first piece of the Portland Commission, a set of cabinet handles that required a level of precision she was still building toward, but was closer to every day. The cabin held the cold at bay. The window was whole, replaced in August with money from the gate contract. The roof had been reshingled by a crew from town. The wood stove kept the main room at a temperature that could generously be called cozy, and on the coldest night she didn't mind the smallness of the space, the way the walls were close and the ceiling was low, and everything she needed was within arm's reach. One evening in January, she sat at her father's table, the one he had built by hand and eaten at for 2 years before she was born, the one she had now eaten at for over a year. The lantern was on. Outside the window, snow was falling, steadily visible in the lantern light as it passed the glass white against the solid black of the clearing. The fire in the wood stove ticked and breathed with the rhythm of something alive. On the table in front of her was the wooden chest. She had opened it to get the Aldrich grandfather's card to reread his address for a letter she was writing, and she had left it open, the items visible in the warm lamplight. The locket on its silver chain, the ring of iron keys, the letter carefully refolded in its original creases, the dark red wax of the broken seal still visible at the edge of the fold. She picked up the hook, the very first piece she had considered worth keeping, made on the 8th day in the forge, the day she had lit the fire for the first time. It was imperfect. The curve was uneven. The tip was slightly off axis. The surface showed the evidence of too many reheats. The metal roughened where it had been overworked by hands that were still learning what they were doing. She had been dissatisfied with it once, unwilling to consider it a real beginning, measuring it against a standard she had not yet earned the right to apply. She looked at it now the way you look at something when you have enough distance to see it accurately without the distortion of expectation. It was a first piece. Every master had a first piece. Every piece of work she had ever admired had been preceded by someone's first piece, by someone's 8th day, by someone's beginning, that looked nothing like where they ended up. The hook was imperfect and it was real, and she had made it with her own hands in her father's forge on the day she decided to stay, and it was the start of everything that had followed. She set it down beside the letter. The lamplight fell across both of them. She thought about Garrett Hollis briefly. She thought about the hallway and the deadbolt, and the way he had not looked up from the papers when he explained what he had taken. She thought about him the way you think about a lesson that was expensive to learn, and that you would not choose to have learned this way, but that you learned completely all the way through, so that you will never need to learn it again. He had taken the money her mother saved. He had taken the apartment and the warmth of a house she had mistaken for belonging. He had handed her the deed to her father's land with the casual indifference of someone discarding something worthless, and told her it was a clean break. He had thought he was leaving her with nothing. He had left her with the only thing that mattered. She put the hook and the letter back in the chest. She set the locket on top of them. She closed the lid. She banked the wood stove for the night and turned off the lantern and went to bed in the dark, listening to the snow come down through the trees, and she slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of peace. The peace of someone who knows what they will do tomorrow and the day after that. Who has found in the work a shape that the days can take, that gives the hours meaning and the effort direction? Who has built something out of nothing and knows with the certainty that lives in the body rather than the mind, that nothing and no one can take the knowledge of how to do that away from you? Outside, the snow covered the clearing and the track and the iron ring on the great door of the forge and the chimney that had been cold and silent for 13 years before she arrived. It covered all of it equally, the way snow covers everything, without distinction, without preference. In the morning, she would go out and clear the path. She would light the fire. She would pick up the hammer and continue the work she had been given and had chosen, and had made her own the work that was hers. Now the way the land was hers, the way the journals were hers, the way the forge and the anvil and the slow accumulated knowledge of fire and iron were hers. The way her father's love was hers, delivered across 13 years of silence and distance, in a letter sealed with red wax in a wooden chest in the corner of a cabin that was still standing when she arrived. The hammer would be in her hand again at first light.